Hello and welcome to Starmergeddon. I'm Ben and I'm joined today by Zac
Hello.
and Rory Taylor.
Hello.
And before we get into it, I should promote our new magazine, which is being published very soon.
Yeah, very soon.
And you can buy it at toolong.news. I think there's...
inkling it won't be that cover though.
No, this cover, there's maybe a figure on there that isn't as relevant as she might have otherwise been.
Yeah.
But we have...
worth a lot, that one.
Yeah, this particular one, yeah. But we have put a lot of effort into this. There's obviously, it's the election special, so we cover elections from all over the world, not least, obviously, the US election, which we'll get onto in a moment. Also the UK election. I think we've done some really good articles in here. I think there's some really good writing. I think we're able to talk about things in a way that we're not able to on videos. So if you are interested in any of that, toolong.news, you'll be able to find it on there, and there is a discount if you get a subscription. So with the promo out of the way, should we move on and talk about the US election? Obviously, we're recording this as the results have come in. We know that Donald Trump will be the 47th president. This is nominally a UK-focused podcast, so I want to talk today about how this is going to impact the UK. So obviously we've had an election relatively recently. We've got a new government, a new Labour government, and on the surface, naturally, that's probably not a party that would get on with Donald Trump normally. So I suppose I'll throw this to either of you. Do you think that this is going to be a tricky relationship to maintain? The special relationship, do you think it's going to be tricky over the next few months and into Trump's next term?
I think...
You go for it.
Okay. I think that it could be, but there's... I'm sure we'll get into this stuff in more detail. There's all these past comments that various Labour figures, including David Lammy, Foreign Secretary, have said about Trump, saying he's a KKK and Nazi sympathiser.
Yeah.
These kind of things that, Trump is a man that holds a grudge, and he often, hits back at people who say bad things about him. But I think in this case... Labour have obviously made efforts before the election to reach out to the Trump team, the Trump people, to try and build bridges. And actually, because of the way Trump is, he sort of reacts to the last thing that people said to him, I think. That's often what people say about him. So I think that if Labour go into this with sort of positively and try and sort of, I'll say treat him well. I don't mean, I mean politely and constructively, not like in deference to him. But I do think it is possible for them to have a working relationship with him.
I mean, you bring up David Lammy. Obviously, he did make the comments you pointed out. But even his vice president back in 2016 said words to that effect, and is now the vice president to Donald Trump. So as you say, I suppose there is a way in which Trump can move beyond personal insults. But I suppose it just runs a little bit deeper than just that, doesn't it?
I also think the politics behind the JD Vance pivot and any prospective Starmer or Lammy pivot are very different, because the JD Vance pivot works to JD Vance's political self-interest because it makes him more popular amongst Republicans, because Republicans are overwhelmingly pro-Trump. But any sort of perceived sycophancy on Starmer or Lammy's behalf towards Trump just won't go down well with Labour voters, or for that matter, like Labour MPs who are, I think, probably quite outspoken in their support for the Democrats, basically. And I also think you're right about the fact that you can repair relations with Trump. That's clearly possible, and a lot comes down to the last thing that happened. But the last thing of note that happened was the Labour staffers going over to the US to help to apparently help Democrats in the presidential campaign.
Then, I suppose,
which Trump put an official complaint to them.
Yeah. That's true. But then Keir Starmer and David Lammy also went and met with Donald Trump a few weeks ago, had a meal with him, tried to, mend relations. I suppose, does that work at least in their favour?
I think it depends what you think is the sort of last politically significant event. I mean,
that's very true.
If the meal counts as a politically significant event, fine. But I think
feel like this is you saying that you don't think that counts.
No, I don't think that. I mean, you never know what the vibes were like in those sort of closed door meetings. But I do think that the fact that Trump did put in an actual complaint to it, and there was some sort of there were some jokey references in there, and I don't know if it was entirely serious, but I don't think that bodes well. The other thing is that it depends how much of a role Musk has to play.
That's a very good point.
In Trump's cabinet, and similarly, actually, what sort of policy Europe and the UK pursue towards Twitter and disinformation, misinformation more generally, because I feel like that's something where the direction of travel policy-wise in the UK is very much towards like, oh, we have to do something about just like the sort of online media ecosystem, and that will probably bring some conflict with Musk and Twitter. And if Musk has a big role to play in the Trump administration, he clearly doesn't like Starmer. What do you call him? Two-tier Kier?
Yeah,
I mean,
that's
I was going to say, he's got form this year in terms of the riots.
Because I think Donald Trump doesn't think about the UK much at all.
Yeah, I agree.
Whereas
exactly.
Elon Musk clearly does. Like, he is fully bought into the idea that the UK is like turned into some kind of failed state. Elon Musk's dad.
Where does he get that idea from?
Elon Musk, his dad was on, I can't remember what radio show it was very recently, and he said Starmer's like full on fascist and, you know, blah, blah, blah. Like, and it completely disconnected with reality. But if this is what Elon Musk is thinking or along those lines, then that is, I think, more significant than Trump's sort of past clashes with UK figures, to be honest.
So I suppose there's certainly evidence to suggest that there might be friction, to say the least, between Labour and the new Trump administration. But I suppose there are at least some signs from his first term that there was some way in which he worked with UK politicians. So particularly the UK-US trade deal that was sort of being pursued towards the end of his presidency and ended up falling through. There is some discussion that could be revived, that could be useful to the UK. Do you think there's any sort of anything behind that? Do you think that could happen, or do you think that's unlikely, wishful thinking?
Maybe I'm out of touch with the sort of political class in the UK because they do seem to take it seriously, but I just have no idea why we're even talking about this. That prospective trade deal has been on the cards for years. It's never happened. And the idea that a sort of like very protectionist-minded Trump with some pretty funky ideas about trade policy is going to sit down with, you know, Whitehall and find some nice middle ground. It's just for the birds, from my idea.
I suppose the reason that this was brought up was just because this seemed to be pursued during the first term, was dropped when Biden came in. There's been no discussion in Biden. And I suppose it's the hopeful, you know, people are hopeful that because that happened in his first term, it might in his second. But I do agree that's, firstly, I think Trump's changed quite significantly since his first term. And I think just because he might have given that the time of day then doesn't mean he will this time round. And he's become a lot more isolationist, as you say. So I think that both of those things are probably true.
I think also Labour probably aren't as into these post-Brexit trade deals as the Tories were. Like for the Tories, it was their whole thing, like we're strike trade deals all around the world now that we've left the EU. But Labour, that hasn't really featured as part of their big vision. So I don't really see.
Yeah, sorry. I mean, tentatively, I would basically 100% agree with Rory. The way I would read that sort of like talk about a trade deal in Trump's first term is probably mostly driven by the Tories. It's just because the Tories made a lot of noise about signing post-Brexit trade deals, especially with the US, which is sort of supposed to be our economic salvation, our new like single market after we left the actual single market. And I think the fact that it didn't happen, it was probably, you know, Trump was probably entertaining it to maintain, you know, happy relations with the Tories and especially Boris Johnson, because there is some sort of personal affinity between those two. And yeah, but I don't think it was, I just don't really imagine it ever being on the cards. I just think it's just so contrary to the sort of Trump's normal way of doing trade policy. And also the attitude he takes to even his allies when it comes to trade policy, or nominal allies when it comes to trade policy. I mean, yeah, Trump is famously super against basically all free trade deals. I mean, what sort of free trade deal is consistent with a policy to put up a universal tariff of 10% or 20%? I don't know.
Yeah, and I suppose trade isn't the only thing that people are sort of worried about here. Foreign policy is another big aspect. The UK was one of the first countries to provide significant support to Ukraine in the early war. And obviously still providing it. Trump's made some relatively worrying statements in terms of how he would approach Ukraine. Do you think this is going to be an area of sort of divergence between the UK and the US? Do you think this could further fracture the relationship?
Yes, I sort of do, but in a way, I'm optimistic that Trump will force European and British politicians to make some difficult decisions on Ukraine, which I think we've sort of been delaying. The current British policy and generally European policy, although I should say that actually the German policy is changing quite substantially, and this is something I don't think people have really talked about enough in the past couple of months. basically because of to sort of stem the rise of both the AfD and the BSW in Germany, who are two sort of vaguely pro-Russia, or at least sort of like pro-peace parties. Olaf Scholz has taken a way more dovish position on Ukraine than he used to. I mean, almost immediately after the Brandenburg or Saxony, which one was the
Saxony
first?
and Thuringia, I think.
Saxony and Thuringia local elections, he started calling for peace negotiations, which, by the way, is what Trump's calling for. So that's not a million miles off. And then more recently, he said that we should reconsider bringing Ukraine into NATO. I'm pretty sure he did say that recently, even though NATO has nominally begun the process of Ukraine's accession, which again, by the way, is a Trump policy at the moment. I say a Trump policy, it's a policy that was actually explicitly articulated by J.D. Vance, but we can assume from that it is therefore a Trump policy. I think that the Trump policy, it's actually hard to know what Trump's Ukraine policy would be. I think there's an anxiety in much of Europe that it would just basically be anti-Ukraine. He doesn't have a good personal relationship with Zelensky, depending on who you listen to. He has a good personal relationship with Putin. And there's this worry that he would basically just say, look, I'm not giving Ukraine any more weapons. You guys just have to accept the lines of control as the new boundaries. That is your new border. You have to give up 20% of Ukraine to Russia, and you're never getting Crimea back. Maybe. There is another reading.
But sorry, just to, I suppose, from the UK perspective, the
UK's current policy. I didn't even get around to that.
Yes.
Yeah. The UK's current policy is basically to do is to support Ukraine until they're victorious.
And that is consistent between the Conservatives and Labour. That seems to be very consistent and one of the things that they're agreed on. So, do you think that that's going to, the fact that they were presumably going to have very different approaches to Ukraine, if Trump does pursue that policy of just letting things, fall as they are, do you think that that's going to really fracture that relationship?
Yeah, I think that will come into tension. But I think that if my point here is that if Trump's Ukraine policy is that policy I just outlined, where he basically just goes, screw the Ukrainians. Yeah. You're on your own now. Europe can pay for your defense if they feel like it, but otherwise you've just got to capitulate. Yeah, which is the worst case scenario from Brussels and Kiev's perspective. Then yes, massive fracturing in US-UK relations, massive divergence of like the policy positions there are just miles apart, right? The UK has this sort of like quite maximalist position of like, we'll support Ukraine as much as we can, basically. We'll even push for maybe British troops training Ukrainians here, maybe even, it's pretty clear now that we do have some British troops in Ukraine, helping them with like long-range missile stuff. That was leaked a while ago, but it's since been quietly confirmed, and occasionally politicians basically admit that it's happening when they shouldn't admit that it's happening. Then those two positions are miles apart, but there was I think a Fox News interview that Trump gave in maybe CNBC actually, in 2023, when the interviewer asked, so how are you actually going to convince Putin to agree to these things? Because it is worth saying that the Trump or the J.D. Vance plan, which is the J.D. Vance has outlined the Ukraine peace plan in more detail than Trump himself, because Trump just sort of like wangles, and J.D. Vance actually gave an interview where he was like, okay, so this is our plan. The J.D. Vance plan is something the Kremlin aren't keen on. And Dmitry Peskov, who's the Kremlin spokesperson, has made this explicitly clear. He said it's just not going to happen the way that you're describing. Because the current J.D. Vance plan is to just say, okay, current front lines, we're going to create a buffer zone akin to sort of North-South Korea thing going on there. And then those are the new borders, right? But Russia has claimed 4 oblasts in Ukraine. Donetsk, Luhansk, and then Kherson and Zaporizhia. And Russia controls most of, I think, all of Luhansk and most of Donetsk, but nowhere near all of Zaporizhia or Kherson. And they've made it clear that they want to take both those oblasts in their entirety, and that's their maximalist war aims, at least as well. They might push further if they made that. And the question then is, what does Trump do? What is Trump's policy if Russia says no to his plan? And again, the anxiety in Kiev is that he just goes, okay, fine, do whatever you want, just go wild, take over the whole of Ukraine. I don't care. Ukraine's a miles away. I'm an isolationist. I only care about America first. But in that interview I was talking about, he said, okay, no, what I would do is I would tell Putin, if you don't agree to this, I will give Ukraine more weapons, bigger weapons. I think he does say the words bigger weapons than they've ever had. Just imagining sort of supersized bazookas. And if that's his policy, that's in some ways maybe closer to the British policy than the current Biden policy is, because the issue that, at least reading between the lines, that the Brits and the French have with the Americans is that the Americans are sort of, or the Biden administration rather, is sort of in this uncomfortable middle ground where they want to provide Ukraine with enough support to sort of like keep it chugging along, but not enough to actually make advances.
And I understand the criticism of that policy, but and I'm keen not to get too into this, but just to push back ever so slightly, in the policy of sort of letting things fall as they are and saying, if Russia doesn't agree to that, then we'll just provide bigger weapons. Does that not embolden Putin to do things like this in the future to other countries? And there's other.
Why would that embolden? As if he says,
he's taken. In that case, he would have parts of Ukraine. He would have been, although it took him a lot longer and cost him a lot more troops, he would have got at least some of what he aimed to do. And part of the reason that countries are providing Ukraine with the amount of weapons that they are is to try and, show Putin that he's not able to invade a sovereign country and take territory. Is that not emboldening a effectively, strongman dictator in crossing sovereign boundaries and taking territory and allowing him to do that? I understand that the argument is to stop the current meat grinder, but is there not a worry that in doing that, it gives Putin the ability to do that to another country in the future?
I understand that from the perspective of sort of preserving those norms about not invading international boundaries, the ideal outcome would be for Ukraine to regain all its territory back to the sort of internationally recognized pre-2014 borders. That includes Crimea. Yeah. The question you have to ask is that feasible? Is that possible at this point? And I think, and I don't want to be too pessimistic about this, and I'm only sort of rehashing the opinions of well-versed analysts, but I think the answer is no. I think that at the moment it is very, very hard to see how Ukraine regains Crimea, in which case, or for that matter, makes significant gains along the front lines. Ukraine is currently losing territory along the front lines, despite pretty significant Western support, and despite some pretty intense conscription policies. Then that's the trade-off. And then I guess I'm not suggesting that it's. I agree. Everyone has that anxiety that by ending the war, with Putin having taken a significant part of Ukraine, the lesson that the other autocrats will draw from that is that actually we can get away with invading other countries and redrawing international boundaries. I guess what you'd have to say is that you have to hope, at least, is that the apparent costs to Putin have been sufficiently high to deter both Putin and other autocrats from trying that in the future. And the costs have been extraordinarily high. The invasion, we should remember, went appallingly compared to what Russia originally envisioned. Under the sort of even the one of the worst Trump plans, Russia still hasn't achieved its most maximalist war aims, which include sort of regime change in Kiev and taking Kiev as well and pushing all the way to Odessa. They haven't done those things. And I guess what you have to hope is that that's sufficient to deter other autocrats. I think the big question though just is about the feasibility of what is the optimal outcome here? How much further can we expect Ukraine to go? And some people disagree. Some people do think that Crimea is still on the cards and we should continue pushing for that. I'm not saying that's necessarily wrong, but... So
I feel like, in summary on that point, it could cause a bit of a tense relationship with the UK government because we might be pursuing different goals in Ukraine going forward.
Yeah, the TLDR here is basically that I think it depends on what precise policy Trump pursues, right?
Yeah.
If it's just, I don't care about Ukraine, they can just do whatever they want, that's a disaster. That would be a massive cleavage in US-UK policy. If, however, it's that position implied by that 2023 interview where it's here's a peace deal, but Russia, if you don't agree to it, Ukraine gets even more weapons. I think that's actually not even miles away from the current Olaf Scholz position, and I think that'd be something that would be fundamentally palatable to the UK.
So I'm just keen to try and get this back onto the UK.
Good effort.
So another sort of overall area that I think some people are worried about between sort of the UK and the US is on the environment. Obviously, Trump has been has a very different approach to environmental issues than the current Labour government. So the Environment Secretary, Ed Miliband, is quite hot on this. Tons of new sort of initiatives and policies in the UK since the election to try and improve things. What's their energy plan called? It's the
Great British Energy.
Great British Energy, yeah, that's one of them. Do you think that this is another, again, in the UK, one of the things that we're looking to do is work with other countries. You know, it's a global problem, requires global solutions. The US is one of the biggest, most powerful countries on earth. Is this going to cause another fraction between the UK and the US? Is this going to be another sort of sticking point between us with this new Labour government pursuing more and more environmental policies and Trump presumably going to push back quite heavily against them?
I think it would only cause a similar situation that happened in the first Trump term when he pulled out of the Paris Agreement, which there was a lot of international condemnation of that. But at the end of the day, other countries couldn't really do much about that. And then Biden went and rejoined it, obviously. Whether Trump pulls out again, I don't even know if that's possible. But ultimately, like, Trump isn't going to be annoyed at or angry at the UK if the UK pursues its own net zero policies. He will do what he wants in the US, and that will impact us all, obviously. But fundamentally, I don't think different energy and climate policies.
Do you think it will affect the UK strategy on the environment in any way? Trump winning. Do you think this is going to affect the way that we approach things because they're aware that America will be less keen to join global initiatives? And
honestly, don't know. I don't know what the answer is to that.
I don't think that Trump's winning should change how we pursue our net zero objectives. But I think that the way America generally, and on a bipartisan basis, is pursuing its nominal net zero objectives should change how we pursue our net zero objectives. What I mean by this is that the one thing that actually Democrats and Republicans don't agree on climate change. Trump doesn't care about climate change, and Democrats do care about climate change. But their policy positions are actually very similar, because Trump cares about environmental technology for geopolitical reasons, because he wants America to stay at the sort of technological frontier. And he doesn't want China to dominate in EVs or dominate in solar panels or dominate in batteries or whatever, just because he wants America to be at the forefront of sort of like the next generation of energy industry, or whatever you want to call it, And so functionally, their policies are very similar, right? It's just basically a fair bit of protectionism for American industries, and then it's, the sort of flip side of the same coin, massive subsidies for those American industries, and enough subsidies to try and convince basically other companies from places like the UK and Germany and France to just pick their manufacturing up and shift it away from Europe into the US. That should change how we do net zero policies, because our current net zero policies is to basically copy that, and I think Starmer calls it the strategic state or something like that, and try and develop our own sort of green manufacturing industry. I think we've talked about this on other podcasts. I'm very skeptical of that, especially with the sums of money involved. I mean, I don't want to be too dismissive of the current Labour government here, but the sums of money involved in Great British Energy are minute. I think we did the maths. I mean, it is literally a tenth of what they originally promised, and they're talking about 27 billion a year, isn't it? It's something like 9 billion over 5 years.
Yeah, but they would argue that it will attract £3 of private investment per pound spent.
That also applies in the US, where, by the way, they're spending something like $1 trillion via the Inflation Reduction Act. And that's subsidizing private investment as well. And that will probably crowd in even more private investment because, well, just America just doesn't crowd in more. It just does attract more private investment. It's just a bigger market. It's just, it's easier to do stuff like build nuclear power plants there. I think there is a tension there, but I don't think it's actually Trump specific. It's America specific, and it's something that actually other European leaders are far more conscious of than we are. The Germans and the French, for instance, get very, very grumpy at the Inflation Reduction Act, and sort of rightly so, because they're like, well, Europe is deindustrializing anyway, and what you're doing here, Biden/Trump, is just accelerating that process by using your enormous fiscal firepower to attract all of our big factories, which we want to keep here so that we can build our own solar panels and just move them all to the US. And so I don't think Trump will care at all about what our policy is, but I think we should care about what other countries, and especially countries that can just do bigger than we can, what they're doing to get to net zero, because it does affect the viability of our thing to get to net zero, of our way of getting to net zero. My point basically here is that there's no point Starmer trying to develop a domestic solar panel industry if Trump is doing that, because we are never going to be able to compete with that. And we'll just be burning through our very limited amount of cash.
Yeah. Well,
I think that.
I mean, it's a pretty, yeah.
I was going to say it sort of raises the awkward Brexit question, where this time where Europe and a Trump-led America might be going their separate ways, and the UK outside of the EU, once again, we're faced with the choice of, do we sort of buddy up to Trump or sort of try and get closer to Europe again? And if Europe is finally going to try and pursue this strategic autonomy that Macron is always talking about, they've failed to do it so far. But if they are to finally go down that road, I think the UK is better off being part of that.
This was how I wanted to.
Left out.
I think this is how I wanted to wrap this up as well. I mean, I know that your views on Macron are well documented, especially on European strategic autonomy. But putting aside the sort of normative questions on this, do you think that how do you think Starmer will approach this, especially with Trump in now? Do you think this is going to be a wake-up call to look towards Europe rather than the special relationship, or do you think that Starmer is going to go down the same route that previous Labour prime ministers have and buddy up to a president that might not share his own views, like George W. Bush?
Yeah, I can't see... I don't know. I was going to say I can't see Starmer going
Sorry,
down...
that is quite a big question to end on. Yeah, why not?
I can't see Starmer going down the full Blair route of following the US into the invasion of a country kind of thing. But I do think
I'm not asking you to predict the future war. I will say that.
I think he definitely will keep going on about, he'll keep stressing the importance of the special relationship and keep talking about the importance of having a constructive relationship with Donald Trump and that type of thing, which is a very standard thing for prime ministers to do. But I think it does ignore the fact that the US really doesn't think about the special relationship that much. It's quite lopsided in terms of how much attention we pay to it. We're at a point where the Labour government we're not even sure if they're going to work out some kind of, like student exchange thing with the EU or like young person's mobility thing. Like, if those are things that we're struggling to work out with the EU, I can't see us taking even bolder steps back towards the EU just because Trump's been re-elected. I don't think Starmer's going to do that.
Okay.
But I might be wrong.
So I think that what's really depressing here is the sort of like the small C conservatism that you just sort of outlined of the Starmer government. I mean, the fact that he's spent so much time talking about how important it is to like maintain relations with Trump and all that sort of shenanigans. Yes, I understand that there are like diplomatic reasons to that, but it is also a symptom of this sort of like, this like Blair-inspired small C conservatism when it comes to like all policy, but especially foreign policy, right? Where, we've been mates with the Americans for a very long time. We should, stay mates with the Americans. And the same thing with the European thing is this sort of anxiety about doing anything that we could consider too Europhilic, right? I mean, like the youth mobility is a good example, but then that sort of like very sort of tentative negotiating that they're doing over that prospective security deal as well. So I think that is frustrating. There is that sort of like fundamental conservatism, which just means that you probably shouldn't expect too much movement in the UK's foreign policy posture going forward, despite the massive rupture that a second Trump presidency represents to just like the global order and the transatlantic relationship. But the one thing I would say about this is that if you leave that aside, you can see how a Trump presidency would actually push Starmer quite a lot closer to Europe. I think security is the really key bit here. And go back to the Ukraine thing. Let's just say that he does withdraw support from Ukraine. And then Europe becomes sort of, it has to become self-sufficient in security terms. If that happens, and even if he doesn't like completely ditch Ukraine, if Europe just decides that actually we cannot just hope that American presidents like Europe and are happy to commit to NATO, we have to sort out our own security and be responsible for our own security, then I think all of a sudden the EU-UK relationship changes quite drastically, because the UK, for all our shortcomings, we are still one of basically the two big security players, maybe three if you count Poland, in Europe. And if Europe really wants to sort out a sort of comprehensive independent security structure, it will almost definitely involve the UK, or at least we're a real player there. And so if that happens, I can see that pulling the US and the UK and the EU quite a lot closer together. Especially if that also involves some sort of like joint defense procurement, in which case we're all trying to develop our sort of like domestic defense industries together. And again, that sort of like quite quickly slips into economic cooperation because it's a security cooperation, but defense covers so many things. It covers AI, it covers tech, it covers, to some extent, like legal systems. And so naturally, it encourages a deeper cooperation and integration between the UK and the EU. The one other thing that I think is really interesting is China. And I think this actually is a sort of like a point, this could be a real point of tension between both the UK and the US and the EU and the US. There have been some tentative signs that actually Lamy and Starmer want to pursue a more conciliatory tone towards China than at least Johnson and Liz Truss did. Johnson actually pursued quite a pro-China policy until basically Hong Kong. And that completely switched his China policy. And then Truss, because she just sort of imports everything from America, was just decided that China was a massive issue remember the first Tory leadership campaign when she started attacking Sunak for being soft on China, which was just really odd. It sort of worked though, the Tory base listened to it. So she was super tough, hawkish on China. And then Sunak was also pretty hawkish on China in certain respects because of the Truss attack line and because of certain people in amongst Sunak, including Tom Tugendhat, are quite hawkish on China. But there have been some tentative signs that actually Starmer and Lamy want to pursue a more conciliatory tone towards China. I think some of this is just economic reasons. I think it sort of almost harks back to the like Cameron Osborne thinking of the 2010s. But I think some of it is that it is just that China could be a really valuable economic partner. There is the Cameron Osborne thinking that we can play a sort of like a role as China's financial hub in Europe or something along those lines, or City of London can play. But like more simply than that, we don't really have a domestic manufacturing industry to protect in the same way the Americans do or Europe does. China has loads of stuff to sell to us. Electric cars is a great example, by the way. We don't have a domestic electric car industry, so we don't have tariffs on Chinese EV imports. By the way, a little bit of trivia here. Because of the way the Brexit agreement is set up, Northern Ireland does have tariffs on Chinese EV imports. So Northern Ireland is single-handedly fighting a trade war with China that we're apparently not supporting them in. But we don't have tariffs on Chinese EV imports.
I'm sure that'll really help the sort of like unionist cause.
Yeah. And that's just because, Chinese EVs are cheap and good. And if we want to part of the energy transition is apparently electrifying our sort of transport sector, then that's useful. We should want those. And I think that policy will come under strain with Trump. Trump will really try to coerce, basically, America's allies to take a stronger stance on China. And the Europeans are currently fretting about what particular policy posture they want to take. But I think that there will quite quickly divisions will emerge between Europe and the US on how hawkish position they want to take on China. And in that case, I think that we might end up closer to the Europeans on the China question. And I think that the China question will be, in lots of ways, like a very important question when it comes to like overall trade policy and like economic orientation, if that sort of makes sense. Does that sort of make sense? As in, I basically just think that the UK and the EU will end up closer together on the China question than the US, and that will create sort of another division, which I do think will actually end up pushing the UK and the EU close together, not just on economic issues and about like how much you want to cut off trade with China, because again, Europe is sort of more interdependent on trade with China than the US in certain ways, but also in security issues. You can imagine Trump taking quite a hawkish stance on stuff like Taiwan, and that really spooking the Europeans, because I don't think anyone in Europe wants to go to war over Taiwan, and we're probably in the same boat. So I'm just saying that the China issue, I think, could also push Europe and the UK closer together and away from the US.
Which is exactly what your idol Macron wants. So it feels like this could work out very well for him.
It could.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both for going through all of that. I know it's a bit of a strange thing to do as the results are still actually coming in some states. So I think it's good we've got this done so quickly. But yeah, we'll have to see as the months roll on and as the Trump presidency actually starts how accurate you both are in your predictions of how this is all going to go.
You know, I saw one tweet, someone suggested that Keir Starmer should appoint Boris Johnson as the ambassador to the US.
Yeah.
Nigel Farage.
I was going to say, why not Nigel?
Why not both of them?
Yeah.
The dream
Fight it out.
team. Yeah.
Sort of exile.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Both favourites of the Labour government, I think, aren't they? They're both quite favourable. Anyway, yeah, we'll wrap it up there. But thank you both for joining. And for anybody watching, it's toolong.news, I think.
There might be a discount code in the description.
Yes, there might be a discount code if you look there. But I don't know what it is, so
It'll be down there.
Nice.
Yeah.
Very good.